The Nebraska Cattlemen meeting in Kearney, and one of those presenting is Joe Schuele with the U.S. Meat Export Federation. Well, Joe, I'm sure one of the things you'll share is the year that was, and it was one that was definitely met with challenges, but overall, I guess we can't complain. We've had fairly decent movement, sans all the challenges.
Right. It's been a solid year for exports, but not quite where we were in 2014. That was the first year that we actually pushed over the $7 billion mark in global export value. We'll be a little bit lower than that this year. Number of things driving that. First of all, we started off the year with a very tough situation with the West Coast port crisis. Our first quarter was hurt badly by that, especially the high-value chilled cuts that we shipped to markets like Japan and Korea. We recovered from that to some degree in the spring and summer months, but not quite where we would hope. The high value of the dollar and some advantages for competitors like Australia in Japan and some of the other Asian markets have pushed us back. Our lack of access to China and the closure of the Russian market also impacting imports, and so I think that with those economic headwinds in mind, 2015 has been an okay year, but we'd like to get back to where we were a year ago.
Well, as we look at the future, one of the things we always like to talk about when we talk with folks from USMEF is we have to talk about China, Japan, the Asia market. Sounds like when the Secretary was over there just a few weeks ago, indications are that we may once again see an opening for beef in China.
Well, demand in China is booming. Their imports are probably going to approach $2.25 billion this year. And just to put that in a little perspective, they're importing about $200 million in beef a month, and that used to be what they would import in an entire year. Up until about 4 years ago, they didn't import that much beef in a whole calendar year. So demand is booming in China. We've had some new entrants into that market, like Brazil. Canada is gaining traction there. Their largest suppliers are Australia and Uruguay. And with every day that goes by, they gain a stronger foothold there, and it's going to be harder for us to capitalize on what is really the world's fastest growing beef market. So it is imperative that we get access to China, and I know that is a top priority for our government officials.
One of the other issues you talked about a little bit is where we are with the U.S. dollar and the impact that has had. Is that one of the driving forces, or is it simply a matter of there's just too much protein around the world?
I don't know that it's a case of too much protein. We have had pretty large production on the pork side this year. Beef production, I think globally, you wouldn't say there's an oversupply, but in the first half of this year, there was a virtual fire sale on Australian beef. They really finished up about 2 years of herd liquidation, where you had record large production coming out of Australia at very low prices, and that was compounded by the fact that the Australian dollar is trading at a very low level. So you did see a surge of supply from Australia going into the Asian markets. That certainly has caused us some heartburn, but you've seen a slowdown now really since about the middle of the year. Australia has started into a period of herd rebuilding. I think that will tighten their supplies a bit and narrow the gap in prices a bit. They'll still have a price advantage, but I think you'll see that gap narrow to some degree.
Let's just talk about our friends to the north. There's been a change with their prime minister, so that means a change in the cabinet. Have you all had a chance to kind of look at that? What does that mean when we look at the partnership still in the North America, or does that change things at all?
Well, Canada is a very important destination for U.S. meat. I think people tend to think that we import meat and livestock from Canada and not much goes the other direction. That's really not true. Canada's been $1 billion market for U.S. beef for quite some time. We might be a little bit below $1 billion this year primarily because of the weakness of the Canadian dollar, but it's a very important destination for us. We don't sense that the new administration is going to be overly protectionist, but we are certainly keeping an eye on that. They have a number of regulatory proceedings. We have people at USMEF who spend a great deal of time monitoring the proceedings in Canada because it is such an important destination for us. It's not a market that we talk about a lot. It's not a market that we do a lot of high-profile promotions in, but Canada is a key market for us and one that we want to keep. We want to keep meat flowing northward.
All right, as you present here to these Nebraska Cattlemen, what other things are you sharing with them today and is looking down the road?
Well, one thing I want to do is just thank the state of Nebraska for the tremendous support for our meat export efforts. When you look at Nebraska, it's not just the cattlemen and the state and the Nebraska Beef Council, but also the pork producers, the Nebraska Farm Bureau, the Corn Board, the Soybean Board, the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. There's a long roll call when we look at our Nebraska membership and the great support they provide us. And I think that our efforts do provide the state with a good return. I think meat exports have been very important to the Nebraska economy. I think our producers here recognize that. Even in a tough year like this, our support has been very steadfast. I think they know that it's important to their profitability. So our being here is in one way to inform, but also to say thank you for the great support we receive.
All right. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you.
Joe Schuele with the U.S. Meat Export Federation has joined us. In Kearney, I'm Ken Rogers.